Sometimes, if I squint a bit and glance at the gap between the GPU and the PCB, I could swear I can see Ethereum dust stuck in there. The reason I was thrilled when receiving this box has to do with the contents. A GCE 4.0 based video card for me to repair and test to see how it holds today. An XFX RX 580 was inside and not the Vega 56 pictured on the box. And just like the smaller ITX RX 570 reviewed recently, this one will also give a serious workout to my 4-cores 8-threads Haswell CPU. The question is, how well does this combination run? This variant of the card has the GPU boosting up to 1366 MHz and is coupled with 8GB of GDDR5 memory running at 2000 MHz. You can get all of the details from the GPU-Z window seen on screen right now, or from the card's description from the Tech Power Up page. See links in the description. For the 185 watts rated TDP, XFX provided a pretty good thermal solution, where the core is cooled through 4 heat pipes and a cold plate. The memory contacts the same heatsink, and the integrated power stages for vCore are also cooled using another section of the same heatsink. 2 PVM controlled fans complete the picture. Under load, the card warmed up to 71C using the default fan curve, for a delta over ambient of 46C. Using the same life-preserving fan curve that I typically use, this dropped by about 10 degrees. The system that had the honor of being the bottleneck in this review is the Z230 workstation using the Xeon equivalent of an i7-4770 and 32GB of DDR3 running at 1600 MHz in dual channel. The first game to point out the system bottleneck is Rainbow Six Siege, where the numbers at 1080 resolution and low settings are somewhat better than the ones at 720. The averages run just shy of 190 FPS and the 1% lows above 120 FPS. This kind of situation will be quite common, so to make the test more relevant for the GPU, the game settings will be raised by quite a bit, at least for the single player titles. Most of the multiplayer games, however, will also carry stats for low settings. One such single player title is Doom Eternal. Thanks to its 8GB of VRAM, the game allows testing at Ultra, Nightmare and Ultra Nightmare quality presets. At 1080 resolution and Ultra Nightmare, the card averaged 109 FPS and provided 1% lows of 81. Funny enough, low settings will increase the numbers by 50%. Not that much really, considering that we're comparing stats at top quality graphics versus low settings. The stats in here for the finals show the same system bottleneck I mentioned. At 1080 resolution, I got the same performance between medium and low settings. Even 720 resolution and medium settings provided the same average in the 60s and 1% lows in the 30s. Other YouTubers had better values with this card, but they didn't test it with a Haswell CPU. In the case of Fallout 4, however, the FPS cap that the game comes with keeps everything in check, and the card is glued to 60 FPS when wandering the wasteland at 1080 resolution and highest settings. Diamond City is tougher to render though, and at the same settings, the average drops to 50, with 1% lows of 40. This is perfectly fine for the single player title. I did not test Apex Legends at low settings this time around, to avoid the CPU bottleneck at around 200 FPS. There are plenty of videos on this channel with somewhat weaker cards reaching that, so no point in repeating that. I ran the game at 1080 resolution and highest settings instead, and the card still managed averages of over 100 FPS and 1% lows above 60. If you need that 200 FPS, then simply dial the settings back to low and tweak the resolution. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is another older AAA title, so 1080 resolution and high settings is the way to go. The built-in benchmark got an average of 55 FPS. The 1% lows of 23 are less than ideal though. I'm pretty sure that the RX 580 can do better in CS2. At the low settings, the averages and 1% lows stayed the same across the resolutions I ran my test at, which is a clear sign of a system bottleneck. As with other cards that were held back by the CPU, I got the same around 120 FPS average and 70 FPS for 1% lows. To avoid bottlenecking the GPU, I ran the benchmark in Borderlands 3 at 1080 resolution and badass settings. That's their label for max settings. The card produced a good gaming experience with an average FPS of almost 40 and the 1% lows staying above 30. XDefiant is best played above 60 FPS, and the RX 580 can pretty much do it even at ultra settings, with an average of 77 FPS and 1% lows of 58. However, the performance gains that can be had by dropping the settings cannot be ignored. Going down a single notch to high has the card averaging over 120 FPS and the 1% lows jump up above 90. Low settings, however, has those numbers creeping up to almost 190 for the average and above 141% lows, and that's how I'd play the game. Resident Evil 4 has the CPU usage well in the 80s range when running at 1080 resolution and the performance preset. The RX 580 is most likely held back by the CPU, but with the average FPS above 90, there is some headroom to increase the visuals. The balanced preset will have the card averaging 56 FPS with 1% lows in the mid-30s. Fortnite averaged 69 FPS at 1080 resolution in high settings using the DirectX 12 API. The 1% lows in the mid-50s is fine by me, but I can see more competitive players willing to trade aesthetics for performance. Medium settings will have these values at 100 for the average and 72 FPS for the 1% lows. However, I will play the game in performance mode, but not for the FPS. I'm too much of a crappy player to benefit from the almost 200 FPS average and mid-80s for the 1% lows. I, however, like to see where I'm supposed to be shooting, and the performance mode gets rid of a lot of the vegetation without sacrificing the far rendering distance. Fortnite Reload is a puzzle to me. I expected higher performance across the board, but the stats collected at 1080 resolution, DirectX 12 and medium settings were worse than what I got in the main map. Performance mode, however, got the RX 580 back to above 200 FPS for average and almost 150 for the 1% lows. Terminator Resistance is a new entry added to the list of games to test video cards with. The game allows even entry-level cards from 12 years ago to play at reduced settings, but the RX 580 can do a lot better. At 1080 resolution and higher settings, the card averaged 81 FPS and provided 1% lows of 66. This is a very comfortable user experience. I tested Overwatch 2 mostly to see if I can drive the card to the maximum of 600 FPS, but I came a bit short. Nevertheless, at 1080 resolution and low settings, the RX 580 manages a very respectable 300 FPS average, with 1% lows of 243. At half the pixel count, that is 720 resolution, I hope to average 600 FPS. The CPU, however, said that 475 is fine. At 1080 resolution and ultra settings, the benchmark in Far Cry 6 had the RX 580 average 54 FPS and provided 1% lows of 42. This is quite a comfortable gaming experience, but if you need more performance, then reducing the settings should help. Although, for this single-player title, I would not rush to trade visuals for a few more FPS. Something is funny with Dota 2. Using the same reply from the same time step, I get almost the same results regardless of the Radeon GPU being used. G4 cards, however, behave better. This needs a bit more investigation. As for the performance of the RX 580 at 1080 resolution and low settings, the average is in the mid-80s and the 1% lows is in the mid-40s. At 1080 resolution and high settings, Control manages an average of 42 FPS with 1% lows at 28. This is close enough to my standards for single-player titles, so I'd probably play the game like that. And if there are a few scenes that require a bit more performance, I'd tweak a bit some of the options. It didn't make sense to test GTA 5 at the lowest settings, so I went pretty much with whatever settings the game suggested. This happened to be mostly high, and at 1080 resolution the RX 580 averaged in the mid-90s, with the 1% lows close to 60 FPS. Since Warframe is somewhat easy on the CPU, I ran my Mariana mission at 1080 resolution and low settings. This got the card averaging close to 290 FPS and providing 1% lows around 185. This is excessive, so do trade those FPS for graphical fidelity. Oh man, I really need an upgrade. This was pointed out by the R9 290X first, followed then by the RX 570 and GTX 970. The RX 580 is definitely held back by the Haswell CPU, and while this might be less of a problem for single-player titles, the experience in the more popular online multiplayer games will suffer, the Finals being the first title that comes to my mind. Now, while the performance is pretty good and the price can drop as low as 60 USD, there is a pretty big chance that the RX 580s out there have had their share of mining. My sample had a busted VRM DR MOSFET, a bad screw that was supposed to keep the heatsink on said DR MOSFETs, and an event or concert bracelet used as a makeshift intrusion detection seal. I chalked all of these up as coincidences, but Sometimes, if I squint a bit and glance at the gap between the GPU and the PCB, I could swear I can see Ethereum dust stuck in there. Regardless of its past, this XFX RX 580 provided me quite a bit of fun. Hopefully you like this video, and I'll see you for